Good afternoon, everyone. Today, we will be discussing about the global city. We have these learning outcomes that at the end of this lesson, we should be able to explain why globalization is a spatial phenomenon, identify the attributes of a global city, and analyze how cities serve as engines of globalization.
If you had a chance, would you move to New York, Tokyo? How about Sydney? Chances are many of you would like to move to these major cities, and if not, you would probably like to visit them anyway. Some of you might have already traveled to these cities as tourists or temporary residents, or maybe you have heard stories about them. You may have relatives living there who have described buzzing metropolises with forests of skyscrapers and train lines that zigzag on top of each other. You may likewise have an idea of what these cities look like based on what you have seen in movies or TV. Do you remember when downtown Manhattan in New York was destroyed in a confrontation between the Avengers, Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, the Hulk, etc., and aliens?
Not all people have been to global cities, but most know about them. Their influence extends even to one's imagination. What are these places? Why are they important, and how are they relevant to you? Why do we need to study global cities? So far, much of the analysis of globalization in the previous lessons has looked at how ideas of internationalism shape modern world politics. We also examined cultural movements like K-pop and how they spread through media like the internet. It is very translucent that global cities are worth studying for due to the fact that cities are precisely the central places in all processes that mutually influence the globalization of people. They also interact with states wherein its objective falls under the global economic agendas, economic development, technological innovation, crucial to questions related to climate change, and more important, objectives. What this lesson will emphasize, however, is that globalization is spatial. This statement means two things. First, globalization is spatial because it occurs in physical spaces. You can see it when foreign investments and capital move through a city and when companies build skyscrapers. People who are working in these businesses or Filipinos working abroad start to purchase or rent high-rise condominium units and better homes. As all these events happen, more poor people are driven out of city centers to make way for the new developments.
We could say that globalization is spatial due to the fact that it resulted in the emergence of the new land uses in order to adapt to the competitive global system, which caused a modification period of the geographical structures. On the other hand, more poor people are forced to go away or being dispelled because of the new buildings or infrastructures that are planned to be built in that certain place or area. We could really say that globalization leads to elevation, but there are still unfortunate people who are driven out of the city centers and find themselves homeless because of the new development that are now concluded to be built.
Second, globalization is spatial because what makes it move is the fact that it is based in places. Los Angeles, the home of Hollywood, is where movies are made for global consumption. The main headquarters of Sony is in Tokyo, and from there, the company coordinates the sale of its various electronics goods to branches across the world. In other words, cities act on globalization and globalization acts on cities.
Hollywood is the home to many famous television and movie studios and record companies. Hollywood is where movies are made for global consumption, considering the fact that it is the largest major film industry in the world. In 2016, the movie industry in the United States and Canada generated $11.4 billion, making it as the most profitable movie industry on the planet. Televisions and many electronic goods continues to expand, and as a result, many countries develop their abilities in the field of filming, and as a part of globalization, the market production of a specific individual were able to increase their profits, and countries continues to elevate their economy. Cities are the engines of globalization. They are social magnets growing faster and faster. In the current generation, urban life has become the dominant form of human life throughout the world. It was established that globalization also involves a rapid movement of people, services, ideas, policies, and capital.
And now, let's move on to defining the global city. Sociologist Saskia Sassen popularized the term global city in the 1990s. Her criteria for what constitutes a global city were primarily economic. Now, I will share a short video of Saskia Sassen speaking about global city.
So there is a need to consult continuously. If you're operating in 25 countries, in 78 countries around the world, you just need access to very specialized elements. How do they do accounting? How do they this, etc., etc. So that is, and I would of course be very interested in understanding how does that global city function operate in your country? What are your specialized domains where you're really connecting to other parts of the world, and you need those other parts of the world? You cannot do it by yourself.
In the year 1991, Saskia Sassen identified global city in 4 ways. First, the key locations for finance and specialized service firms, which have replaced manufacturing as the leading economic services. Second, sites of production, including the production of innovations in leading industries. Third, highly concentrated command points in the organization of the world economy. And fourth, the markets for the products and innovations produced. In her work, she initially identified 3 global cities: New York, London, and Tokyo, all of which are hubs of global finance and capitalism. New York has the New York Stock Exchange, or NYSE, London has the Financial Times Stock Exchange, or FTSE, and Tokyo has the Nikkei. The amount of money traded in these markets is staggering, which means immensely surprising or astonishing. The value of shares traded in the NYSE, for example, is $19,300 billion, while that of the shares in the Philippine Stock Exchange is only $231.3 billion. The New York Stock Exchange is a concentrated location that brings corporations and governments so that investors can buy and sell proprietorship. Auction-based exchanges such as the New York Stock Exchange allow traders and brokers to physically and verbally communicate buy and sell orders. The NYSE is also known as the Big Board and one of the oldest and largest stock exchanges on the planet. It certainly stands as both a symbol of capitalism and as the financial center of the US. Based on research, I also want to share that stock defined as the share in ownership of a company. The Financial Times Stock Exchange Group is a financial organization that specializes in the management of asset exchanges and creating index offerings for the global financial markets. Based on Investopedia, through its primary markets, the London Stock Exchange provides cost-efficient access to some of the world's deepest and most liquid pools of capital. London Stock Exchange enables companies and governments from around the world to issue securities such as shares or bonds to raise capital. The Nikkei of Tokyo monitors and measures the performance of 225 large, publicly owned companies in Japan from a wide array of industry sectors. However, limiting the discussion of global cities to these three metropolises is proving more restrictive. Recent commentators have expanded the criteria to determine what constitutes a global city. San Francisco can now factor in as another global city because it is the home of the most powerful internet companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google. In China, Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou are now centers of trade and finance. Chinese government reopened the Shanghai stock market in late 1990 and has grown to become the fifth largest stock market in the world. Others consider some cities global simply because they are great places to live in. And in Australia, Sydney commands the greatest proportion of capital.
Next, let's tackle about the indicators for globality. So what are the multiple attributes of the global city? The main reason for this is the economic power. Saskia Sassen, a Dutch American sociologist, noted for her analysis of globalization. She remains correct that economic power largely determines of which cities are global. It is truly an accurate idea of Sassen because here are the proofs of which cities are global, and this is because of their economic power. Let's start with New York City. From the year it was created 1792 until the recent time, New York Stock Exchange is the largest stock exchange in the world, with an equity market capitalization of just over $28.4 trillion as of September 2021. The New York Stock Exchange is the busiest and most important financial market in the world. Its stocks are traded by investors worldwide. Then Tokyo. Tokyo is the economic center of Japan. Tokyo is the largest number of global companies' headquarters. It is one of the leading economic cities not only in Japan but in the world, with about 613 companies establishing there in the city. Compared to New York, its closest competitor, there are 217 company headquarters. In Tokyo, there are 660,000 businesses accounting for over 10% of the entire country's total and employing about 9.6 million people. The top industries of Japan is based in Tokyo, like printing, broadcasting, telecommunications, banking, insurance, and financial services companies. Out of 613 companies, 15 are Fortune 500 companies. Top companies that have established their headquarters in Tokyo include Sony, Hitachi, Canon, Rakuten, Casio, many more. The growth of Tokyo as a top economic destination for large companies began after World War II, as most of the top companies sought to take advantage of better access to government services within the capital. Shanghai may have a smaller stock market compared to New York and Tokyo, but plays a critical role in the global economic supply chain. Why? Ever since China becomes the manufacturing center of the world, Shanghai has the world's busiest container port, moving over 33 million container units in year 2013. Economic opportunities in global city make it attractive to talents from across the world. Since 1970s, many of the top IT programmers and engineers from Asia have moved to the San Francisco Bay Area to become some of the key figures in the Silicon Valley's technology boom. London remains a preferred destination for many Filipino with nursing degrees. To measure the economic competitiveness of a city, the Economist Intelligence Unit has added other criteria like market size, purchasing power of citizens, size of the middle class, and potential for growth. Based on this criteria, even though Singapore is a tiny city, it is considered as Asia's most competitive city because of its strong market, efficient and incorruptible government, and livability. It also houses the regional offices of many major global corporations. Global cities are also centers of authority, like for example Washington, D.C. It may not be as wealthy a city as New York, but it is the seat of American state power. People around the world know its major landmarks: the White House, the Capitol Building or Congress, the Supreme Court, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Washington Monument. Similarly, compared with Sydney and Melbourne, Canberra is a sleepy town and thus is not as attractive to tourists. But as Australia's politicians' capital, it is home to the country's top politicians, bureaucrats, and policy advisors. The cities that house major international organizations may also be considered centers of political influence. The headquarters of the United Nations is in New York, and that of the European Union is in Brussels. An influential political city near the Philippines is Jakarta, which is not just the capital of Indonesia, but also the location of the main headquarters of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or the ASEAN. Power political hubs exert influence in their own countries, as well as on international affairs. The European Central Bank, which oversees the euro, the European Union's currency, is based in Frankfurt. A decision made in the city can therefore affect the political economy of an entire continent and beyond. Finally, global cities are centers of higher learning and culture. A city's intellectual influence is seen through the influence of its publishing industry. Many books that people read are published in places like New York, London, or Paris. The New York Times carries the name of New York City, but it is far from being a local newspaper. People read it not just across America, but also all over the world. And now let's go to Boston. One of the reasons for many tourists visiting Boston is because they want to see Harvard University, the world's top university. Many Asian teenagers are moving to cities in Australia because of the leading English language universities there. Education is currently Australia's third largest export, just behind coal and iron ore. Significantly ahead of tourism, in 2015, the Australian government reported that it made as much as 19.2 billion Australian dollars, roughly 14 US dollars, from education alone. Los Angeles is one of the most dynamic economies in the world, with a fast-growing and immense high-tech industry, world-leading creative economy, tremendous strength in aerospace and advanced transportation, the nation's largest manufacturing base, the nation's largest international trade industry, and a rapidly increasing amount of venture capital investments in startups. With over a dozen major industries, the LA region is also known for innovation as creative coalitions occur where industries overlap, driving new business concepts and entirely new sectors, making LA the creative capital of the nation. All this success can be traced to a highly diverse, skilled workforce and visionaries who are reinventing everything from transit to translational medicine. As venture capitalist Mark Sester said, "What I love about LA is it represents the best our country has to offer. LA is a leader amongst the most cohesive large cities I can think of in the world." We have already explained why Los Angeles is the center of the American film industry, and that is the reason why it is considered as global city. A less obvious example, however, is Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. It is so small that one can tour the entire city by bicycle in 30 minutes. It is not the home of major stock market, and its population is rather homogeneous. However, Copenhagen is now considered one of the culinary capital of the world, with its top restaurants and commensurate with its size. As the birthplace of new Nordic cuisine, Copenhagen has set into motion various culinary trends like foraging in the forest for local ingredients. Here is the example of their famous restaurant. Manchester, England in the 1980s was a dreary industrial city, but many prominent post-punk rock bands came from this area. Here are the following renowned rock bands. First is a band that formed in 1976 in Greater Manchester, England, the Joy Division, that became one of the legendary and pioneering icons of post-punk new wave bands. Then, the Smiths were also an English rock band that formed in Manchester in 1982. They are regarded as one of the most important acts to emerge from the British independent music scene of the 1980s. Lastly, the Happy Mondays are an English rock band formed in Salford in 1980 that hailed from this city. Those are the rock bands that making it a global household name. In Southeast Asia, Singapore again is slowly becoming a cultural hub for the region. It now houses some of the region's top television stations and new organizations, MTV Southeast Asia and Channel News Asia. Those various art galleries and cinemas also show paintings from artists and filmmakers, respectively, from the Philippines and Thailand. It is, in fact, sometimes easier to watch the movie of a Filipino indie filmmaker in Singapore than it is in Manila. It is the cultural power of global cities that ties them to the imagination. Think about how many songs have been written about the New York. Jay-Z and Alicia Keys' Empire State of Mind. Frank Sinatra's New York, New York is one of the A-list of old-school New York anthems, and numerous songs by Simon and Garfunkel, and how these references conjure up images of a place where anything is possible. A concrete jungle where dreams are made of, according to Alicia Keys. All those songs is about New York City. It's because for them, New York City is a place where their dreams come true. Today, global cities become culturally diverse. In a global city, one can try cuisines from different parts of the world because of their large Turkish populations. For example, Berlin and Tokyo offer some of the best Turkish food one can find outside of Turkey. Same as the story in Gian Latif Laksa. Manila is not very global because of the dearth of foreign residents, despite the massive domestic migration. But Singapore is, because it has a foreign population of 38%, and those are the indicators for globality.
Global cities conjure up images to fast-paced, exciting, cosmopolitan lifestyles. But such descriptions are lacking. Global cities also have their undersides. They can be sites of inequality and poverty as well as tremendous violence. Like the broader processes of globalization, global cities create winners and losers. In this section, we list some pathologies or simply the deviations giving rise to social ills of the global cities based on the research of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Cities can be sustainable because of their density. As Richard Florida notes, ecologists have found that by concentrating their populations in smaller areas, cities and metros decrease human encroachment on natural habitats. Denser settlement patterns yield energy savings. Apartment buildings, for example, are more efficient to heat and cool than detached suburban houses. Moreover, in cities with extensive public transportation systems, people tend to drive less and thereby cut carbon emissions. It is no surprise to learn that largely because of the city's extensive train system, New Yorkers have the lowest per capita carbon footprint in the United States. In Asia, dense global cities like Singapore and Tokyo also have relatively low per capita carbon footprints. What is per capita carbon footprints? Per capita is Latin prepositional phrase which literally means by the head, but it is used to mean per person or individual. Carbon footprint, on the other hand, is the total amount of carbon dioxide and methane gas you release into the environment by consuming energy. Not all cities, however, are as dense as New York or Tokyo. Some cities like Los Angeles are urban sprawls or spread out areas with massive freeways that force residents to spend money on cars and gas. And while cities like Manila, Bangkok, and Mumbai are dense, their lack of public transportation and their government's inability to regulate their car industries have made them extremely polluted. More importantly, because of the sheer or rising size of city populations across the world, it is not surprising that urban areas consume most of the world's energy. Cities only cover 2% of the world's landmass, but they consume 78% of global energy. Therefore, if carbon emissions must be cut to prevent global warming, this massive energy consumption in cities must be curbed or controlled. This action will require a lot of creativity. For example, many food products travel many miles before they get to major city centers. Shipping this food through trains, buses, and even planes increases carbon emissions.
Will it be possible to grow more food in cities instead?
Solutions like so-called vertical farms built in abandoned buildings, as is increasingly being done in New York, may lead the way towards more environmentally sustainable cities. If more food can be grown with less water in denser spaces, cities will begin to be greener. The major terror attacks of recent years have also targeted cities. Cities, especially those with global influence, are obvious targets for terrorists due to their high populations and their role as symbols of globalization that many terrorists despise. The same attributes that make them attractive to workers and migrants make them sites of potential terrorist violence. Only by looking from this perspective will we be able to understand the 9/11 attacks that brought down the Twin Tower of the World Trade Center in New York and the November 2015 coordinated attacks in Paris by zealots of the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, or ISIL. When Donald Trump, a real estate magnate who has a total net worth of $2 billion was elected as the President of the United States, security experts believe that properties around the world that carry his name may be targets of terror attacks. There are Trump towers, for example, in places like Istanbul and Manila.
We have consistently noted that economic globalization has paved the way for massive inequality. This phenomenon is thus very pronounced in cities. Some large cities, particularly those in Scandinavia, have found ways to mitigate inequality through state-led social redistribution programs. Yet, many cities, particularly those in the developing countries, are sites of contradiction.
In places like Mumbai, Jakarta, and Manila, it is common to find gleaming buildings alongside massive shanty towns. This duality may even be seen in rich urban cities. In the outskirts of New York and San Francisco are poor urban enclaves occupied by the African Americans and immigrant families who are often denied opportunities at a better life. Slowly, they are being forced to move farther away from the economic centers of the cities. As the city attracts more capital and richer residents, real estate prices go up and poor residents are forced to relocate to far away but cheaper areas.
This phenomenon of driving out the poor in favor of newer, wealthier residents is called gentrification.
In Australian cities, poor Aboriginal Australians or their mainland's indigenous peoples have been most acutely affected by this process. Once living in public urban housing, they were forced to move farther away from the city centers that offer more jobs, more government services, and better transportation due to gentrification. In France, poor Muslim migrants are forced out of Paris and have clustered around ethnic enclaves known as banlieues.
In most of the world's global cities, the middle class is also thinning out.
Globalization creates high-income jobs that are concentrated in global cities. These high earners in turn generate demand for an unskilled labor force such as hotel cleaners, nannies, maids, and waitresses that will attend to their increasing needs. Meanwhile, many middle-income jobs in manufacturing and business process outsourcing like call centers, for example, are moving to other countries. This hollowing out of the middle class in global cities has heightened the inequality within them. In places like New York, there are high-rolling American investment bankers whose children are raised by Filipina maids. A large global city may thus be a paradise for some, but a purgatory for others.
Global cities, as noted in this lesson, are sites and mediums of globalization. They are therefore material representations of the phenomenon. Through them, we see the best of globalization. They are places that create exciting fusions of culture and ideas. They are also places that generate tremendous wealth. However, they remain sites of great inequality, where global servants serve global entrepreneurs. The question of how globalization can be made more just is partly a question of how people make their cities more just.